and monster.
Welcome to Eye to the Sky, the UFO Synopsis. Now here's your host, Andrew.
And welcome to Eye to the Sky, UFO Synopsis, here on the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, also broadcast live on UPRN 105.5 New Orleans. I'm your host, Andrew, and tonight my guest is Brent Mitchell. But before I get started and introduce my guest, I would like to wish researcher and radio host Alejandro Rojas a very, very happy birthday. Keep up the good work, Alejandro. My guest this week was supposed to be on the program last week, but due to technical issues, we had to reschedule the show. I want to thank my guest for agreeing to reschedule his appearance on Eye to Sky for today. Brent Mitchell is the Alaska State Director of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, a certified field investigator, and a member of the MUFON STAR team, which is a rapid response team of professional UFO investigators. Brent is the Alaska investigator for Q4s and is an underwater specialist in the use of side-scan sonar technology. Brent is a member of the International Association of Dive Rescue Specialists, and Brent has done extensive research on underwater UFOs in Alaskan and Russian waters. A guest on radio and television, Brent has been called Alaska's top UFO detective on the Discovery Channel's program, Monsters and Mysteries of Alaska. I spoke with Brent on the phone last week, and after our chat, I was amazed by the rich history Alaska has with regards to UFO-related activity. I have no doubt our discussion tonight will be fascinating and informative. I am very pleased and honored to welcome as my guest tonight, Mr. Brent Mitchell. Brent, you're a busy man.
Yes, and for being in Alaska, it's busier than you think of here this time of year.
Oh, well, you've got more daylight hours this time of year.
That's right. We've got almost 24 hours of daylight, so everybody gets what they need to get done because winter's already on its way. Once you pass the summer solstice, the days start getting shorter again.
And this is a typical question. First question I usually ask most of my guests is, what got you started on the UFO topic?
I started a real interest in UFOs when I was in high school, and you can probably tell my age by the books that I read, but when Eric von Daniken was first coming out with his series on ancient astronauts, and I read that, and I was hooked, and I was adventuresome at that point in my life, so I took a year off and went down to Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador, and decided, seeing the mysteries down there, that my life was going to somehow take a path in exploring the unknown, and that's what got me really started, and it's just progressed from there.
Oh, now you have me jealous. I wanted to see those sites in Peru and Ecuador and all over down there, especially Pumapunku.
There are so many sites that have relationships to UFOs, and the more you read about them, the more you see them, the more you study, it just increases the mystery. And I don't know whether we'll ever solve all of these mysteries down there, but if you ever do get the opportunity to travel down there, it'll be well worth your while.
I agree. I think that would be, a lifelong ambition to accomplish. In our phone conversation, you mentioned some World War II era ships and their involvement, with the Japanese taking, the western islands of the Aleutians. And you gave me a couple of names, and one of them I wasn't able to find much on, and that was the Deerloff. So now you've got my curiosity up on that particular ship.
Well, in 1945, It's actually pronounced the Delaroth. It was named after one of the founders of Alaska, strangely enough, and he was a Greek explorer. And this ship was one of those kind of ships that just things happened to it. And it was also one of the ships that was used to transport Native Alaskans into detainment camps in the state of Washington during the Second World War. But this ship, it plied waters that were way off of the Alaska coast, and it would be most ships would not go into that area. But in the month of March in 1945, 15 of the crew saw a dark sphere rise out of the water, and it followed the ship for approximately 15 minutes and circled the ship. And this ship was involved in a lot of other type of UFO incidences, but this one was particularly well documented because of the number of crew members that saw it. And this one was also just one of a number of ships off of Adak Island, starting in the 1930s and going all the way up to the present time, that have had encounters with UFOs.
And that brought up another question for me with all these ship sightings, but I'll leave that one for a little bit later. In some of the looking into I did on the Williamson, on one site there were so many reports concerning the Williamson that, frankly, I didn't get them all read. This ship had quite a variety of sightings. The ship must have been of great interest to them.
I think that the Williamson has a unique history, partially because of its location during the Second World War. In 1943, the Williamson was one of a number of ships that was stationed out in the Bering Sea to rescue pilots that had gone off course or run out of fuel and had to ditch in the ocean. And as a result, it was way out there where nothing else was. And it gave the Williamson an opportunity to end up pretty much in UFO Central during the Second World War. Many of the crew reported sightings, and the sightings that were reported by the Williamson were consistent with the description of the craft that they sighted, and how it came out of the water was consistent with many of the other ships in the area. But this one, the crew was really not hesitant to report it officially. And this is one of the sightings that I have been researching for a number of years, trying to talk to crew members. And there's a couple of the old guys that are in their 80s and really want this story to be told. So I'm hoping that at some point in time someone will pick it up on a television program, or that they would be a guest on a radio show somewhere, because these gentlemen have fascinating things to say about the sightings aboard that ship.
Can you give us an example of some of the incidents that happened concerning the Williamson?
Yes, there was one particular sighting that occurred on, it's been listed as the April 30th all the way to May 1st, the memory of some of our 80-year-old veterans is not as sharp as it once was. But on that evening, there was approximately 15 people on watch, and one person, one of the witnesses that I spoke to, was on the starboard gun crew. And he was looking off to the side and keeping watch, because it was a combat zone, and everybody was trained to look, at the horizon for anything that might be unusual. And out of the sea, some sort of vessel came out of the sea, and it was, it appeared at first to be on the surface. So the crew sounded battle stations, and everyone came up to their gun crews, and they watched this what they thought was a vessel, and then they noticed that there was a row of red lights on the port side, and it seemed to be paralleling the ship. It wasn't acting aggressively, and it wasn't moving toward them, but then they noticed that the lights were getting higher in the water, and that didn't make any sense to anyone at that point in time. And when the craft was about 100 yards from the ship, they realized that it was not on the water, but it was hovering above the water. And so everyone is absolutely fascinated. There was an entry made into the ship's logbook, and I haven't been able to contact any of the ship's officers, and maybe by their age they're no longer around, but the enlisted men that I talked to said that this craft continued to pace the ship for over an hour. And at midnight, some of the crew was relieved, and a new gun crew came on deck, and they reported that it stayed almost till dawn. And our witness said that there was pictures taken of it. I haven't been able to find at this point in time the pictures that were reportedly taken, but all the testimony of the witnesses and their descriptions matched. So there was definitely something there. It was some sort of UFO, and it was seen by almost the entire ship.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, it makes you wonder what was going through those guys' minds when they were seeing this.
From the witnesses that I spoke to, at first they weren't sure because it wasn't acting aggressively, but they were still frightened. But once they saw that it was above the water and hovering, they were genuinely frightened, which is a pretty common reaction when you see something that you have no idea what it is, and you're hundreds of miles from the nearest place that you can go hide.
That's what I was just thinking. You're trapped on a ship out at sea, and you can only go as fast as the ship.
That's it. And where do you go?
No place to run and hide.
One of the things that one of the witnesses, and he's 83 years old, and he was absolutely, thrilled to share this story. It was a life-changing experience for this person, and his entire adult life, he has tried to share this story because it's something that he wants the rest of the world to know, that there is UFOs. There are UFOs. He saw one. His shipmates saw them in the middle of World War II. This was the experience that most affected his life. And as an investigator, that helps me to determine the validity of the sighting report. And there's no question that the people on board this ship saw something absolutely extraordinary.
Were any of them told to keep quiet?
No, and this is really unusual. And I think part of the reason they were told that they didn't have to be quiet or weren't sworn to secrecy is because the entire crew saw it. And when you get that many people witnessing an event, you can't keep everyone quiet. Whereas if you have somebody in a radar station in Nome, and there's 3 or 4 people, and they've seen something, you can pretty much track them down. But an entire crew of a vessel, fortunately for us, they weren't sworn to secrecy.
Okay, and this happened around April 30th, May 1st of 43?
1943.
Yes, a few in our virtual auditorium didn't quite catch that, so I thought they'd get that out again. This ship had quite a few run-ins with strange objects. How many in total were there?
I've gotten reports of 3. People have said that there are more. It's hard to track down the witnesses, and as an investigator, I'm very meticulous on my sightings, and so as far as I'm concerned, every one of those guys is absolutely telling the truth. But if I don't have a second, third, or fourth witness on an event, then I don't list it. But with this group on this particular sighting, there were 4 witnesses still around that I was able to get confirmation from. But I'm sure that the individual stories, there's sometimes 5, 6, 7 incidents. But this one was perhaps the most well documented, and everybody was in agreement as to the details. So that's a pretty solid sighting.
Was this ship out of ADAC?
Yes. And ADAC is one of those places in the world that is an absolute UFO hotspot. Every 5 to 10 years that there is sighting report that is a government sighting report, which is very unusual. As you know, Dee, to get the government to come out and say, yeah, we recorded this sighting on this day, and it was by this crew or that crew or this aircraft, and to have it documented is really an amazing thing. And ADAC has one every 5 to 10 years since the Second World War, continuing up to 2008.
Well, the World War II era, when this naval air station there at ADAC was up and running, or the height of its career, so to speak. Did they get a lot of ships coming in saying, "Hey, we saw this, we saw that. What was it? Can you tell us what it was?" That kind of thing.
They did, and one of the sighting reports and incidents that I'm also investigating right now, and I only have one witness, so I'll tell this as a story rather than as a documented factual sighting, is a Coast Guard cutter was coming into the port at ADAC and ADAC is an island. It's way in the middle of, it's the end of the line, pretty much. And they had just been on convoy patrol, and they were coming into the port, and they were chased by a UFO with the same description and same lighting pattern as the one that was reported with the Williamson. And so far we've only had one sailor, and we haven't been able to find anybody that can corroborate that report. But the person who made the report, you could tell he was not kidding. So all through the war, there's been reports, and there's also been a tremendous amount of aircraft disappearances in that area.
Well, I can understand why. Weather conditions, storms can blow up just at the drop of a hat up there in the Bering Sea.
Absolutely, and most of the aircraft that are disappeared don't vanish without a trace. But there's an abnormal number of disappearance reports, especially from 1943. Two B-24Ds from the 21st Bomber Squadron in January were on a mission with a number of other aircraft. And the weather was, in fact, very bad, Dee, you are correct. But two of those aircraft disappeared without a trace. Other aircraft had to make emergency landings and had returned to base, but no one ever saw what happened to these two B-24s. So it's just one more incident of the mystery around ADAC.
A question that was just sent, I spot rather, in our virtual auditorium from Gossamer. He says, I wonder if the Japanese ever spotted any UFOs near there, because they actually had a battle with the U.S. forces in the Aleutian Islands.
That's a great question.
Was there?
I said that's an excellent question. I don't know if there are records, but that would be something fascinating to look into, especially because of the frequency of UFO sighting reports from American forces at that point in time and in that area. That's something I'll look into. That's an excellent question.
Oh, when you find out the answer, let us know.
I will do that, Dee.
That'd be something I'd be curious to ask. Part of this ADAC island thing, you were kind of alluding on the phone here a couple of weeks ago that might be the Alaska version of Area 51.
That yes. That's something that we really would like to look into here in Alaska. It's very strange with the number of base closings taking place in the United States and military installations all across the country. Over the last 10 years for cost cutting, the ADAC Naval Air Station is shut down. But if you fly over ADAC, it is in pristine condition. It is maintained. The hangars are functional. The tower is functional. And there seems to be a tremendous amount of activity every once in a while there. So what's going on there, nobody's saying. But it would be nice to be a fly on the wall of that tower on cold and dark night, because there's a tremendous amount of money being spent to maintain a facility that's that cold and that far from the United States.
Well, and then I was looking, good old Google Earth, that there's a town there on the island. Do you get a lot of reports from them?
No, not a word from that town. Their livelihood depended on the base and to some extent still does. I have not gotten one sighting report from an inhabitant of that island.
That's interesting.
Uh-huh. When we talk about sworn to secrecy, it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
I was just thinking that and was going to say, wow, if you can't swear 112 men, which was the complement of the Williamson, to secrecy, but yet you can an entire town.
Yeah, it makes you wonder.
That is interesting. Gosh. And you were saying that well, I myself am a fan of Deadliest Catch. Those guys are either crazy or very brave or both to make a living out there on the Bering Sea like that, especially, January. Gosh, when there's not much daylight and it gets really, really cold. Do you get any reports in from these fishing vessels that go out and fish the Bering Sea?
Some. They're quite an interest. They're a really great representation of the Frontier Alaska character, and I can understand why that show is so popular. You get some reports that's very limited. They're a tight-knit group, and people in Alaska, like anywhere else, are divided into different groups, but we have a particularly large group of people that have a frontier mentality, primarily because we live out here in the frontier with wild animals, and you go outside and there are actually things that can still eat you. So there's a code of macho frontiersmanship, and people don't want to be looked upon as strange. And as you well know, that reporting a UFO or making a sighting report or discussing anything that's out of the ordinary, in some circles you're looked upon with suspicion, or if you might be looked at a little bit crazy, and some pretty tough fishermen don't want to look sissified or a little bit crazy among their peers. So we don't get as many reports as there actually are occurrences out there.
Well, that's pretty much typical because of the ridicule factor.
Yeah, and it's probably the same frequency among crab fishermen as there would be among aircraft pilots.
Oh yeah, I can understand that very much so. But of the few that you do get, are they the typical underwater sightings, or stuff coming up out of the water and flying away, or flying in and going into the water, that kind of thing?
From the fishermen, you don't get a lot of them coming in and out of the water reports. Most of the reports of UFOs entering or coming out of the water come from the military, and since the opening up of Russian military records, a lot of the reports that I'm researching now are from Russian vessels in the same general area, and they reported a tremendous amount of UFO activity coming in and out of the water. But as far as fishermen go, they mostly, it's the lights in the sky type of sighting report, whereas the military is much more specific and much more oriented to watching the surface of the water, and there is an awful lot of activity around that area of the Aleutians.
That's interesting that only the military vessels would see that either going into or out of the water. That's something I hadn't expected.
And the quality of the reporting from the military is also quite good. The Russian records are fun to go over, but there's a lot of hoaxing, a lot of misinformation. So those records will take some time to really go over. But as American military records are being declassified now, and there's sighting reports from the 50s and 60s that have been released for that area. And in addition to coming in and out of the water, many of these sightings have been recorded by AWACS-type aircraft, radar aircraft, and there's some phenomenal reports. And you can, as you read over the reports, you can see that the crew of the aircraft absolutely knew that they were looking at a UFO. And as the report goes up the chain of command, you can start with a strictly UFO. We saw a flying saucer. It was going 700 miles an hour or 1,500 miles an hour to, I think it was a commercial airline maybe, so we'll just file this one. And I've got a report in my hand from 1958 that does exactly that. Just 100%, this is a UFO. We're tracking it. It's on the radar. We're turning it in. The pilot, 2 radar officers, and an enlisted man signed the report, turned it in, and by the time it was going through Washington, D.C., the naval officer who was in charge of the intelligence officer listed it as a commercial Northwest flight, and a military intelligence officer from the Army said, no, it's not, it's a UFO, and he's got it handwritten at the bottom.
Interesting.
So it takes a lot of courage for pilots and crew to report this, and the fact that so much of this activity from Alaska is coming to light, and the documents are being released showing the UFOs is really a cool thing for us in Alaska. It gives a lot of validation to what's going on here.
You know, and then you mentioned that you were doing some research into Russian vessel sightings. What kind of stuff have you found?
A lot of the reports from the Russian Navy have been released. There's a movement very much like the movement in the European Union currently for some nations to release all the information and put it out there and let people look at it and make their own decisions as to the validity of the sightings and what's going on. The same thing's taking place in Russia right now. There is high-ranking military officers that want the Cold War era things to be brought to the light of day, and for the public to make their own decisions as to what went on. And part of the neat stuff that's coming out of that is the UFO reports, and the Russian Navy in particular are meticulous record keepers, and there's submarine log reports of underwater contact with vessels of some kind that can do 2,000 knots underwater. Well, there's nothing in technology that in the foreseeable future that can go anywhere near that fast, and yet these Russian combat submarines are reporting confrontations or encounters with vessels under the water that can do unbelievable speeds. And if you're in the Russian military, you don't make a habit of saying things that aren't true. And if somebody was willing to write that in a log and turn that in, that there's a certain amount of validity just in the fact that somebody turned that in. So I think over the next few years, as more and more things come out of the Russian Federation, that there are going to be some really exciting and interesting advances in ufology.
There's been a lot of talk about disclosure and whatnot. Do you think maybe that since the United States is really dragging in their feet, so to speak, on disclosure, do you think maybe the Russians might beat the U.S. to the gun?
I'm sure they will. I think that they don't have as much culturally and socially invested in the phenomenon. They're not, and this is strictly my opinion, they're not as dependent on information not coming out as just let it out and let the people make up their own mind. It's not something that that is going to affect us. We have other issues right now, whereas the United States government appears to have much more concerted efforts to try and not disclose.
Okay, I see your point. And since you've been doing some research on the Russia side of the ocean, so to speak, have you ever gone into Canada to investigate any reports, or do you ever work with any of the Canadian researchers?
I don't. The Alaska, as you know, is so large that it keeps me busy just dealing with Alaska sightings, and there is so much fascinating sighting information. And going through the MUFON cold case files when I took over the position of state director, going back and solving cases that are 10 or 15 years old and getting to talk to witnesses and research that keeps me really busy. I would not rule out at some point in time going down to Canada, especially the Yukon Territory, because it's absolutely gorgeous and it is as sparsely populated as the Alaska interior here.
Okay, makes sense. In another area that we had discussed too over the phone was the Native Alaskans and their attitude toward the subject, which I thought was pretty darn cool. I just wish everybody else had that kind of attitude, towards the subject. What kind of reports have you gotten from the Native Alaskan population?
That's really a fascinating area of research for me, is because of the isolation of many of the native villages, there is a reluctance for native people to discuss topics that they perceive as a religious nature, like Bigfoot or things that you see in the Aurora Borealis or UFOs. That's something that's not spoken of to the general public a lot. Fortunately, my daughter-in-law is native and has opened a whole world of investigatory opportunity for me, and a lot of it came to light when I was researching the JAL 1628 flight information, and there was a NORAD radar station out at Fort Yukon, and that got me asking questions out there, and lo and behold, the native population out there is like, we've seen this for years. My grandpa told me about this UFO and that UFO and what we see in the sky, and it's no big deal. It's something that the people that have lived there for millennia are used to. It's not a big deal to them. As far as they're concerned, it is just a part of living out there. It's a phenomena that is as common as the sun coming up in the morning. And of course, I was absolutely fascinated. And what they see and the way they describe it absolutely corresponds with what the pilots and radar operators have filed in their reports. So it's native people. If I was independently wealthy or had a great grant, I would spend 2 or 3 years just going to the various villages and talking to the native people there and getting UFO reports, because I think it would open an absolute world of information for us.
And I just another question from our virtual auditorium. This is from New York Lily, and she asks, does MUFON get a lot of cases in Alaska?
Yes and no. For the size of Alaska, it's very rural, so we don't get a per capita number of sighting cases. But when we get sightings, we have a lot of witnesses, which is, it validates the sighting reports. There's probably villages that have never reported UFOs and have seen, hundreds. But the reports that we do take with MUFON here in Alaska, it's a limited number of reports, but it's easy to validate and easy to investigate because the number of witnesses is usually quite large, which is why the JAL 1628 incident is one of the most famous UFO incidents because a lot of people saw it, a lot of people saw it on radar, and people as far away as the Aleutian Islands on that same day reported the UFO. So when there is a sighting report, it's easy to validate.
Well, that was an aspect I wasn't aware of with the JLA fight, that people on the island saw it.
Yes, and it's really interesting. The more publicity and the more that particular incident was on the various television shows, I was getting reports from various witnesses who said, I saw this on TV, and it just so happened my brother, and this was a fishing boat one, so I said that they don't report very often, but here was one that was a validation, as we were out fishing on our boat, and on that same night, and we saw that UFO, and I just wanted to let you know that they were telling the truth, that we saw it too. So
wow.
we get a lot of validations from unexpected sources as we get more publicity.
Would you like to inform our listeners who aren't familiar with the Japanese Airlines incident on what happened that night?
Yeah, the JAL 1628 incident is one of the most thoroughly documented and credible sighting reports because of the quality of the witnesses. It took place on November 17th in 1986. The incident began over Fort Yukon, Alaska, which is on the flight path to Fairbanks and on to Anchorage. A Japanese 747 cargo aircraft with a crew of 3 was flying from Reykjavik. The flight started in Paris, and it was carrying it was an entire flight of French wine, so that might account for some of the sighting report, but it was
I don't think any of those guys opened up any of that wine.
No, only the Aeroflot, from what I understand, is the pilot's drink. But from the Reykjavik to Anchorage leg of the flight was under the command of Captain Terauchi, and his co-pilot was now, or afterwards, Captain Tamafuji, and they were flying outside of Fort Yukon. It was about 5 o'clock Alaska time, between 5 and 6, and they had just entered the Anchorage Air Traffic Control space, and they were at about 35,000 feet, and the captain saw a set of lights, 2 lights, at about 2,000 feet below him and approximately 3 to 6 miles from his aircraft. And he was watching the lights, and since he was flying into Alaskan space, he assumed that it was a military aircraft from either Elmendorf or Eielson Air Force Base here in Alaska, until the lights stopped and that they recognized that it was 2 UFOs. And they were so close that the light from the UFOs actually warmed the faces of the pilot and the co-pilot and illuminated the cockpit. So from that point on, it was a game of cat and mouse and hide and seek, and this poor Japanese airline flight trying to avoid colliding with these lights, which were very, very close to him. The amazing part about this was that usually when an aircraft encounters a UFO, it's not recorded on radar. this encounter was, in fact, captured on military radar and the Anchorage Center radar. So both the military and civilian ground radar picked it up, as well as the onboard weather radar on the aircraft. So we have independent confirmation by the crew and then the military and the FAA. And the game of cat and mouse lasted for approximately a half an hour. The two lights that they initially saw and the two spacecraft that they initially saw disappeared at approximately the 20th minute of the encounter. They looked behind them and to the right, and they saw what they described as a giant spaceship bigger than the size of an aircraft carrier. This also showed up on radar, and it appeared to be 7 to 8 nautical miles behind the aircraft. So the Air Force also seen this object on their radar, scrambled fighters, but the commercial air traffic center in Anchorage had a United Airlines flight that was on its way to Fairbanks, and they asked that aircraft to actually intercept the JAL flight and see if they could spot the object that was still showing on radar behind it. But by the time the United flight got to the JAL flight, the object had disappeared from radar, and the Japanese airliner crew no longer saw the object. So they didn't get the independent confirmation from the United aircraft, but by that time it was no longer showing on any of the radars or the weather radar on the JAL flight. And it caused an absolute uproar with the FAA. There was testimonies and hearings were held, and the result of that is that something was up there. It was a UFO. It showed up on radar, and the FAA couldn't deny it.
Well, they tried to keep it quiet, but
they did, Dee.
But the FAA incident investigator that went down there to investigate the incident and presented the information to whoever, whether it was the Air Force or whatever, I forget which. In fact, I can't even remember the guy's name. All I remember is that he was part of Dr. Greer's Disclosure Project news conference at the press club, and he had all the documents right there. He had the radar tracings, he had all the computer printouts and everything right there with him. And we wouldn't have that information if they hadn't have forgot to take it from his office.
You know, there's a lot of times it's just by luck that we have the evidence that we do, and it's a good thing that a lot of these air traffic controllers and station directors have the courage to speak up and say, this is what these pilots saw, and we saw it too, and here's the evidence to back it up. Because so much of the evidence that would really contribute to our understanding of this phenomena is buried.
I don't doubt that in the slightest. I think that happens all the time. We have another question here from our virtual auditorium, and this one's from Missing Time. And he asks, I wonder if the guest has noticed an increase to Bigfoot sightings as well when UFOs are reported in Alaska.
When I was working with the Discovery Channel project on monsters and mysteries of Alaska, that was a subject that came up, and for some reason, and as a UFO researcher, I don't really research Bigfoot, but having had that experience of dealing with a program that had the two on the same thing, there does seem to be a correlation in general of UFO sightings and other phenomena. Now, whether that is, coincidence or directly related, I don't know, but there definitely seems to be some sort of correlation.
I've heard that said several times. Makes you wonder if if the big hairy one is just as interested in finding out what the heck these things are as we are. You know?
Exactly. I'm sure that every creature on this planet at some point in time is going to wonder, and hopefully we'll all have the answer at the same time.
And may that be quickly.
Yes.
As soon as possible. You know, some of the few stories that and I hate to use the term story because that, you know, could be taken as being a fictional story, but incidences that have come out of Alaska are very few and far between. And is that because of the remoteness of the area, or just that, you know, it just doesn't get that well publicized because of the remoteness?
I think it's a combination, Dee. I think that we are very, very remote here in Alaska, and there is a culture here that is a little bit different than in the lower 48, is that people have a tendency, whether it's native or non-native people, to keep to themselves. And it's kind of that macho frontier attitude, and that and it's changing. I want to make that really clear. I mean, it's not like it used to be, but to speak out on subjects that are outside of the norm, shall we say, is difficult for some people, and especially difficult for people who are raised in the particular culture. So it's a process. The reports that do come out of Alaska and the things that do get published, what makes them exciting is that they are well documented and well validated. And so if you get a report out of Alaska that something's happened, you can pretty much bet that it's true and real. I mean, people will tell tall stories, and Alaska is known for that. But when it comes to UFO sightings or even some paranormal activity and stuff, you can pretty much take it to the bank that there's some truth in it.
Are there any UFO sighting hotspots or times of the year where UFO sightings occur the most there in Alaska?
There are. The Adak area is one of them. The Kenai Peninsula, and I don't know whether that's as much a hotspot or because the population is significantly greater there, that there are more sighting reports. But the interior of Alaska here, even though it is sparsely populated, is absolutely a UFO hotspot. And I think that part of the reason that it is a hotspot is people are used to looking at the sky here. We don't have smog. The winter we have snow and it's overcast, but we have as many clear nights as cloudy ones, and you can reach out and touch the stars here. The sky in Alaska is probably as beautiful as anywhere on Earth, and it is absolutely crystal clear. And in the interior here, we have no city lights. We have the town of Fairbanks, but other than that, there are no lights. So everything that's in the sky is crystal clear. And so people look up. You know, you're looking for the aurora. You're looking at meteor showers. So with everybody, that lives here looking up at the sky whenever they go outside, people have a tendency to notice, minute changes in the sky and things that you would not see in other places. You would have the opportunity to see here in Alaska.
Interesting. I just didn't think that there would be hot spots up there because of again, how sparsely populated the state is.
And there may be, excuse me.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead.
There may be hot spots, Steve, that we don't even know about because nobody's there.
Good point. Very good point. I hadn't quite considered that. And I'm also curious if you're saying you're doing some follow-up on some cold cases, which I think is kind of a interesting pun since you're in Alaska. Do you do a lot of follow-up work on some of these cases that are reported?
I do, and the reason I do is there was a period of time here when there was nobody investigating it. MUFON has been up here for a number of years, but there was a lack of UFO investigators, and there was a lack of MUFON representation, and so many of the cases that are really fascinating, the people were never contacted. And it's important that every sighting report be followed up on. There are things that, very, very subtle pieces of information that can mean a great deal to the advancement of the knowledge of the phenomena that get missed. So I have gone back over the last 2 years and pretty much closed every open MUFON case from the last 15 years, and some of them turned out to be really fascinating, and others were, a light in the sky. Gee, there's nothing I can tell you more than you saw a light in the sky. But other sighting reports were absolutely fascinating, and witnesses had the information in their minds, just seared into it. It's like it happened yesterday, and it would be a case that 8, 9, 10 years old, and they were ready to tell their story. It was a life-changing event, and they wanted to share it.
There's a couple of people that have been asking the same question here in our virtual auditorium, and let's see, we've got about a minute and a half or so before we go to break. But they're asking if there's been any reports around I can't think of the name of the volcano, the one that was erupting here recently there on one of the islands.
We have a lot of volcanoes, and I have one report from 2 years ago. No current reports of sightings, but I have a really fascinating picture that was submitted by a private pilot around one of the volcanoes here in Alaska, and it's really an excellent picture. And we've submitted it to MUFON, and we have some scientists who evaluate the pictures, and this one came back as an absolute unknown. So there have been UFO sighting reports around various volcanoes, but none within the last 2 years.
Ah, interesting. I've heard a lot of reports from around volcanoes all over the place, so that was kind of curious to myself as well. And on that note, we need to head for a break. So we will be back here in 9 or 10 minutes or so after a break, and we'll come back and talk some more with Brent Mitchell here on Eye to the Sky, the UFO Synopsis on UFO Paranormal Radio Network.
Welcome to Eye to the Sky, the UFO Synopsis. Now here's your host, Andrew.
And welcome back to Eye to the Sky, the UFO Synopsis, here on the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, also broadcast live on UPRN 105.5 New Orleans. I'm your host, Andrew, and tonight we've been talking with Brent Mitchell. Brent, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, like with the weather extremes and the ruggedness of the landscape. How much does that affect the field work you do?
A lot of times, in the winter, you can't really go out and do anything. My home is located in the interior of Alaska, where winter temperatures will range from 20 to 50 below. And so if there's field work to be done, one doesn't do it in the middle of winter. In fact, people die in the villages, and they just put them in a cold spot and wait till spring because it's so cold you can't even bury people here in the winter. So field work is done in the spring, and our spring usually is May through June, and summer, and then into fall. And fall, things start to freeze up and get really cold in October. So you have a very short period of time where you can actually do field work, at least in the interior and the north. And in south central Alaska, Sitka and some of the Juneau coastal islands stuff, you can do investigations. During the winter, you have access by aircraft and stuff. But for most of Alaska, when the first snows fall, you're done with field work.
That's understandable. Very understandable. We have a question from our virtual auditorium, and this is from Pulse Brent, and they asked, how close was the JAL flight path to the base you had previously mentioned? I'm assuming the one at Adak. And how many Native Alaskans also saw this?
The flight path of the aircraft, they have different assigned jet routes over Alaska. It's kind of like a freeway in the sky. And so the aircraft was very, very close to the base here in Fairbanks. The pilot could actually see the Air Force Base while the UFO was still behind him. He was looking out the front window and the UFO was behind him. As far as the proximity to Adak from when the UFO was first encountered, it would be like going from Arizona to Minneapolis. That's how big Alaska is, and that's how great the distances are. So close to an Air Force base, but far away from Adak.
Okay. And the second part of the question, how many Native Alaskans saw it?
Quite a few over the Fort Yukon area. That was the most heavily populated. And when I say heavily populated, it's like anything in Alaska that has more than 200 people is heavily populated. Quite a few substantiated the sighting and have made other, when we've talked with them, they've had other sighting reports. Not a lot of Native people around the Fairbanks area saw it, but there wasn't any confirmed sightings in the Fairbanks area other than radar sightings. So as the sighting continued and progressed toward the Fairbanks area, people lost sight of it. But over Fort Yukon, that sighting, as well as other sightings in the years before and certainly up to present time, they see things all the time.
And another question from our virtual auditorium. This one's from Dimensional Stars. And she asks, do you believe that UFOs are either probes or manned extraterrestrial craft?
Okay, I will give you my personal opinion, not speaking as a MUFON representative, but my personal opinion. I think that there are different types of UFOs with different origins. I don't think there is one answer to that question. I think that UFOs, and I can tell you from my own sighting experiences, that they are under intelligent control. Whether they're manned or unmanned, I don't know. I think there's enough sightings of entities. I think that there's enough evidence of verified abduction cases that one could safely make the assumption that some of these vehicles are indeed manned and controlled by entities from outside of our planet. I'm also not beyond being open to evidence that some of these UFOs might be of dimensional origin, or even an Earth origin of a species that we have not yet identified. So, to answer your question easily, yeah. Yes, you're right.
I can agree with that. I think some of the smaller ones, the little tiny ones are an unmanned probe, and then the bigger ones are the ones that are manned. I mean, you get reports of things the size of a basketball.
Yes.
And to me that I mean this might be just a human presumption that there couldn't be a life form that size that would fit in it to pilot the thing, you know. But I think the smaller ones like that would be an unmanned probe.
I would tend to agree. The one thing that I'm not sure of is because my investigative, prowess is limited by my own prejudices and educational background and stuff. I don't know the answer to, a lot of these, but I would tend to think that tiny is unmanned, just like UD, and the bigger is, you can pretty much assume that if it's that big, it's going to be carrying some sort of crew.
Pilot? Or pilot crew, yeah.
Right word, because you don't want to make the assumption that, it's got an entity that is extraterrestrial. But on the same token, I have spoken with people, and although I am not an experiencer, I have never been abducted, I can tell you that I have had contact with UFOs. I have seen UFOs, and there is no doubt in my mind that they are intelligently controlled.
Oh, well, they'd have to be, in my opinion, in one way, shape, or form, be it, remote piloted, like our UAVs that we've been sending over into the Middle East, or even to the bottom of the sea, for that matter.
Absolutely.
That's where I'm coming from on the unmanned probes. Oh gosh, let's see. Do you have any information on any recent sightings or sighting cases that you've been working on?
I'm trying to think of a couple ones that would be really interesting for your readers. One of the things that we've seen in Alaska with our sighting reports is the sighting reports seem to go in patterns as far as the shape and color of the vehicles being reported, or the lights. Right now we're into the boomerang and triangle phase in Alaska, and most of our sighting reports that we're getting are of large, very large boomerang and triangular-shaped vehicles. And some of the reporting sightings that we're getting, these craft are 300-400 yards across, and they're coming from very credible witnesses. One of my favorite reports is from a taxi driver down in the Anchorage area, and he was taking a passenger to a doctor's appointment, an older lady, and they were driving along the road, and this 400-yard craft literally stopped not more than 50 feet from them, and was hovering over the forest for approximately 20 minutes. And he stopped his cab. He's a cab driver. He didn't have a camera, no way to document it, but he just watched this craft hover, and he's absolutely credible. I mean, he is not someone that would make up this story. And the description that he had when I talked to the other witness, this old lady, she did not want to discuss it, but she said everything that the cab driver said was absolutely true, and she was scared to death, and she hoped she never saw anything like it again. And when I talked to this gentleman, because the sighting was so credible and fascinating, that perhaps he'd want to come forward and speak on a radio show or be part of a television documentary on the sighting, he absolutely refused because he didn't want to look silly. But it was absolutely one of the best sighting reports and the most detailed, because the object hovered for so long that his drawings and everything of it were excellent.
You hear that a lot. People are, not just with airline pilots, because airline pilots can lose their job if they do. So that's understandable why they keep their mouths shut. But the rest of us, the majority of people are too afraid to, because of that.
They absolutely are, Dee. I got a sighting report that 2 days ago from a woman who had reported the sighting. It was over 1.5 years old now, but when she first reported it, she called the Alaska State Troopers that there were anomalous lights operating in her area, and she thought they were helicopters, so she called the state troopers, which is, because of the size of our state, and we don't have a lot of local police except in the big cities, the troopers handle everything. And she called the troopers, and the troopers took the report, and this was one of the few times when somebody was actually had a camera that worked, and she got the most fascinating pictures, which she sent an email to me just yesterday, and I'm going to send them on to Bruce Maccabee and Mark D'Antonio, who are two scientists that do much of MUFON's picture and video work. This woman tried for a year and a half to get someone to listen to her here in Alaska, and she finally reported it to MUFON, so I got the case immediately. But she was afraid, and the first thing she said to me is, Mr. Mitchell, please don't think I'm crazy, but this is what I saw. And her story, she has 3 other witnesses, she's got great pictures, but there is a stigma that people, aren't encouraged to report UFOs. And shows like this one that open people's minds and that let people know that what you see is true and real, and the validations that you give your listeners, that's what's going to make a difference in finally coming up with some answers to the questions that the UFO phenomena brings.
That's very true. I see that a lot, but then when you get people, just one-on-one, they feel so relieved that there's someone that will listen to them and not think they're crazy.
Yes.
We have another question from our virtual auditorium, and this one's from New York Lily, who is a member of MUFON here in New York, and she asks, do there seem to be more sightings in the summer or winter, and do you think it has to do with the amount of sunlight or darkness, or because of the amount of people outside looking up?
That's a very good question. I tend to get more sighting reports in the winter, primarily because it's dark. And when it's dark here, it's really dark. It gets dark at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sun sometimes doesn't come up till 11 in the morning. So we get about 20 hours of darkness. So people are looking up at the sky also in the winter because of the aurora. So the majority of sighting reports come in the winter. The best pictures come from, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, come from the tourists. The daylight UFO sightings pictures and that we get in the summer is that people are out taking pictures of the landscape, and every once in a while, accidentally they'll catch something. But more times than not, they have spotted something in the daylight and have their cameras because they're taking pictures of the bears and get some really, really outstanding photographs. So definitely more sightings in the winter, more pictures in the summer.
Oh, interesting. Very interesting. And if you don't already hear it already, my cat's up here meowing at me. And this is another question from our virtual auditorium. This is from Eternal Being. And he asks, have any of the sightings been reported in detail to indicate in the nature of their substance and behavior that indicate their possible origin, much like that which humans would construct, or of a less tangible, semi-material appearance?
I have some case reports that describe beings. That's a really interesting subject. Yeah, to answer your question directly, yes. And many of the beings are not your, in the case reports that I have dealt with, are not your, standard gray Nordic type aliens. They are more fluid. They are larger. I guess the Nordics are considered fairly large, but they don't have any of the tiny tiny beings reported, and they're much more, I want to say fluid, but fluid, refers to water, and they're not watery, but they're wispy almost. And the two reports that I have, the two cases that I've worked, both of these occurred and were reported during the time of an aurora. So I haven't been able to draw any conclusions or make any solid correlations with anything other than these two reports, but they didn't fit the typical entity profile that you would find in other locations.
Oh, interesting. I had never heard of them, of ETs described that way. ETs are extra-dimensional, however you want to file them. Gosh, that's something to think about.
I had never run across it either. And this was going back through the cold case files. These were two reports that were really fascinating. And when someone sees something like that, it has such a profound effect that to get somebody to revisit that, especially because the one person was very, very frightened because the particular entity was actually in her driveway. So she didn't want to talk too much more about it. It was, behind her. But her descriptions and everything were very unique, and I had never run across that type of description of an entity before either.
Very interesting. Here's another question from our virtual auditorium. This one's from Missing Time, and he asks, any UFO crashes in Alaska?
Not that I know of. We have a lot of sightings that people say that the UFO has gone down. There was a sighting report that was reported by probably 10 to 15 people and was in the Kodiak, Alaska newspaper that people had witnessed a UFO going down behind the mountain and seen a flash. So you could assume that it was a crash. Since Kodiak has a large Coast Guard base, the Coast Guard and the state troopers both sent out helicopters, and this happened at night. So they sent out the helicopters at night, and then search teams during the day. Nothing was ever found. It was really unusual because so many people saw something go down, and it wasn't a meteor because it made some strange maneuvers prior to it going behind the mountain. So may have been a crash. I don't know. I didn't go on site to investigate it because once the Coast Guard is there, they pretty much keep everybody else out. The troopers are pretty good here in Alaska. If you say, I'm a MUFON investigator and I'd really like to take a look, over the hill there and see what there is to see, they'll be cooperative. But once you get military involved, that pretty much puts me out of the picture on it.
Yeah, pretty much end of story.
Yeah.
I have another really good question from our virtual auditorium, and this is from Cartoonist. Hi, Dennis. He asks, we hear a lot about crop circles. Are there such a thing as snow circles, designs in the snow? Just wondering.
I don't know the answer to that. I have never had one reported, but because we have so much of our state covered in snow, that would be a good question for me to ask a couple of the native villages. But I have not seen one, but that certainly doesn't mean that they do not exist. And that's a great question. I'm gonna write that one down, and next time I'm out in some of the villages, I'm gonna ask that.
Oh, I will be interested in knowing the answer. We would have to get you back on for that one.
Yeah, if I find one, I will definitely call you, Dee.
Oh, I look forward to that. Oh gosh, geez, I've heard of circles being found in other parts of the world in the snow that have no reasonable explanation, and even circles that look like they have been melted in the ice on lakes and rivers that are attributed to UFOs. So, gosh, with all that snow in Alaska, there's
there's bound to be something. I just personally have not heard of it, but I'm certainly going to ask about it now because that's a fascinating question.
Oh gosh, that's got my curiosity up as well. Gosh, let's see. Where do I go next? Oh yes. Your Q4s. Would you like to talk a little bit about them? Until talking with you, I wasn't aware of that particular organization.
Yeah, that organization was started by some MUFON people in California that decided to start their own organization for a variety of reasons. Every UFO organization, that's too much of a generalization. Many UFO organizations are plagued with internal politics. And so every once in a while you get a group that breaks off from the main group and decides to that they want to either investigate differently or have a different perspective on a subject and want to go off on their own. I very much am a supporter of MUFON because what I don't know, someone else in MUFON does. And with my personal connections and relationships with some of the state directors and the people, I can get information that I absolutely have no idea. You know, I pick up the phone and say, hey, you know, I've got this, and this. What can you tell me? With the California UFO people, they don't have quite the network, but they have a different approach to their manner of investigating cases. And as an investigator, I very much enjoy the way MUFON has things structured, and it is extremely professional. But every once in a while, you might run into something where you want to look outside of the box. And so I am associated with a couple of organizations. My primary loyalty and responsibility is to MUFON, but I keep an open mind on the subject, and if somebody has a better idea and a better way to do something, I'm all for it. So I try and stay in contact and in good graces with as many people as I can, because no one group or no one person has the answer that we're looking for, but everybody can contribute something.
Interesting. Here comes David. Just as I had another question here. This is from Gossamer, and he says, I know Alaska has many places that are well known for great hunting and fishing. Alaska has some isolated lakes that can only be accessed by bush pilots. Have there been any reports from these isolated areas by pilots who fly into these regions?
That's a great question. Yes, there has. And I'm going to check my laptop because there's a really interesting case I might be able to bring up really quickly as we talk here. There was a gentleman, and this case took place in 2005. It's a bush pilot. Okay, there we go. Yeah, there was a bush pilot that was flying out of Fairbanks, and he was flying up toward the Fort Yukon area, actually to a little village called Chalkitsik. And as he was flying up, he had his friend and then his friend's son. And as he was flying up, they looked down, and on the ground they spotted a UFO on the ground.
Wow.
And so he didn't get any pictures or anything, but he had 3 witnesses. And so yes, bush pilots do make reports, and they are often in places that no one else can access. And their pilots are some of our absolute best witnesses because they're trained to observe things in the air. They're professional. They're generally well educated. They wouldn't be flying if they couldn't see. And so some of the most fascinating Alaska sighting reports in addition to the JAL flight, come from pilots. But this was from a Bush pilot, and he did spot a UFO on the ground. And after investigating that case, I had to absolutely list that one as a definite UFO.
Wow. And seeing it on the ground is amazing. Did he circle it or just to get a good look?
No, he saw it. They all saw it, and it was a your typical saucer type shape. But this guy, it's like 60 years old. You know, he was not someone that would make up a story like that. And the other witnesses was also an older gentleman who was a veteran, and the son, who was a young man who just the passenger's son was 100% enthusiastic about sharing the story. The pilot was he had reservations. He didn't want to look silly, but it's like, I saw this, and it was in the middle of absolutely nowhere. It wasn't near a lake, but it was in the forest on the way. It was close to the Yukon River, and he needed to share it. He filled out the report. So every once in a while, you will get a Bush pilot that it'll have something really great like that.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm glad you picked that one. That one was a good one. Oh gosh. Another thing that you're involved with is the rapid response team. How often do you get sent out to a site to investigate?
The STAR team is MUFON's pretty crack team of investigators. I don't get sent out all that often because I'm really not only am I part of the STAR team, but I respond to any UFO sightings on the ground or specific ones here in Alaska because I'm the senior investigator and the state director. So just about any sighting of any interest or consequence, I go out on anyway. The last year, for the first time, the STAR team was had a corporate sponsor and was the STAR team members were reimbursed for their expenses, which was the first time that UFO investigators were actually reimbursed by a private corporation. So that was kind of neat.
Oh gosh, I love hearing these tales of these teams being sent out. Debbie Siegelmeyer, I think is her last name. She's also on the team as well, and is a member of the International Association of Dive and Rescue Specialists as well. Were you a part of her underwater UFO team that she had put together?
No. Different team. In Alaska, we're so isolated, Dee, that it's difficult to connect with other teams and stuff. And I just think that people like Debbie down in the lower 48 are making great strides in advancing the knowledge of the UFOs. A lot of the stuff happens around water and underwater, and it's people like Debbie that are going to, just open a lot of doors and bring a lot of things to light. So I applaud any dive team member for any UFO organization. I think that it's an expensive personal thing to do. There's a lot of expense in the equipment. There's a lot of expense in transportation, and everybody does this out of their desire to gain knowledge. So I think people like Debbie are awesome.
This is a question from combined listeners, several of them that are abductees in the room in our virtual auditorium. And basically what they're asking is if you had seen the movie The Fourth Kind, and what do you think of Hollywood flat out falsifying info about the town and the incidents portrayed there and claiming it was based on true events.
Well, I appreciate that your audience knows that it was film and fiction and falsifying information. My emails and my telephone rang off the hook for 2 weeks because of that movie. I think it does a disservice to every serious researcher in this country when someone claims that a UFO movie or documentary or whatever is fact when in fact it is fiction. And I can understand somebody wanting to make a buck on a topic, but the poor people of Nome, Alaska. In Alaska, the people disappear for a variety of reasons. The weather is horrific. You can disappear walking home from the store in a blizzard, and you'd just be gone. To suggest that aliens had captured all these people out of poor little Nome, is really insulting to not only the people of Alaska, but UFO researchers. There's no creepy, scary aliens abducting people out of Nome, Alaska.
Good answer. Very good answer. Gosh, when David and I waited until it came out on DVD and rented it and watched it, and they got some of the abduction stuff right, but the rest of it was just so hokey.
Well, when somebody writes something and that they're out of Chapman College in Orange, California, and try and make it Alaska realistic, I went to Cal State Fullerton, so I can speak from experiences. There is no similarities between Southern California and Alaska, and it was even bad fiction. Not only was it bad UFO fiction, it did not accurately portray life in Alaska either.
That sounds about right. Gosh, I mean, the town that they had in the movie didn't even look like it was Alaska. It looked like it was northern Idaho in the middle of winter.
Nome's Nome. It's like your average listener would not want to live in Nome, but for the people who live in Nome, they're great people, and they have perhaps, I'm looking at my sightings reports. I have one UFO report out of Nome. And no abduction reports out of Nome. If you are really interested in people disappearing in Alaska, you can go to the Department of Public Safety website for the state of Alaska, and you can see how many people fall through the ice, they drown, they disappear in the snow. But you're not going to... There's logical explanation for disappearances in Alaska, and most of it is, carelessness or the weather. It's not aliens in Nome.
We have another question from our virtual auditorium, and this is another one from New York Lily. She comes with some really good questions. And she asks, have you ever received inquiries on sightings from any government agencies, either American, Canadian, or Russian?
That's a very interesting. Would you repeat that question? I'm going to be careful on how I answer this question.
Okay. Have you ever received inquiries on sightings from any government agencies, either American, Canadian, or Russian?
Yes.
Care to elaborate?
Yeah, to a certain extent. We have a really good... there are some people in the state, some government agencies and employees of the United States government that are really, really helpful and positive and cooperative with UFO sightings. Those people are few and far between, but they are treasured resources in my investigation process. So I don't want to reveal too much, but yes, there are. It works both ways. If I'll give you an example that I can share, is there was about 2 years ago there was a meteor that went directly across the interior of Alaska, and it was seen from clear where I live as far as the town of Tok. And there were probably 150, 200 witnesses and sightings. And I was immediately contacted. Do I know what this was? What did it look like at my end? And this was a contact by a government employee. So it works both ways. As far as specific sighting reports, I don't get contacted a lot by the government because usually they are there first. And once the government is there first, I'm pretty much locked out. But with the Alaska State Troopers, they are very cooperative and a good partner in solving some sighting mysteries.
Well, how many reports do you get that are sent to you from the troopers? Be it from themselves or reports that were reported to them?
A handful a year. No more than 10 in any given year, and most of them unofficially. The reports that we get from the troopers, most people have reported it to MUFON. If they're going to report it to the troopers, they're going to report it everywhere, because they're not afraid to, come forward and say, this is what I saw. But whenever we do get a sighting report from the troopers themselves, and this goes almost all the way up to the commandant of the troopers, is very cooperative and really looks out for the best interest of the people of Alaska, and that includes solving the UFO mystery. If something's in the sky, they want to know what it is, and if they can help identify it, great. If they don't know what it is, they're going to try and find out. So it's a good law enforcement group to be able to work with, and we're lucky we have them here.
I have another interesting question here. We've got about 4 minutes left. 6 minutes left. I'll get it right yet. My math is awful today. This is another question from Gossamer, and he asks, some of the native Alaskans have persons who carve totem poles. Have you ever seen many faces on any of these totems that looked alien?
That's a great question. I don't know. I have looked at many totem poles. They are from the coastal peoples here in Alaska, mostly from southeast, the Tlinkits and Haida and other coastal peoples, and I don't get down there that often. I have watched totem poles being carved because of the style of that artwork. You can maybe see, you can read that into it. It's entirely possible that there is some sort of alien influence because of the style of the work. That had to come from somewhere. But I can't give you a definitive answer. I don't know.
Interesting. That would be another thing to look into, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Out of all the cases that you have investigated, which one is your favorite?
One that we didn't even talk about this evening. Actually, it was a report from August of '83, prior to the JAL incident, where there was a commercial pilot who was flying at 40,000 feet off of Juneau and spotted a UFO, and it was also picked up on radar, but there were other aircraft witnesses. This gentleman's account is absolutely riveting of what he saw, and the speed at which the UFO maneuvered and took off, thousands of miles an hour. It was like a poof, but you could see see it take off. And this guy waited 30 years to. He had been an experiencer of UFO sightings for a number of years. And this one happened in '83, and his story, I spent hours researching his story with the Air Force and other airlines and stuff, and his story by far is the most fascinating case that I've worked.
Okay, and another question that's being asked in our virtual auditorium is, do you have a website?
No. Actually, I'm a very private person, but I'm really happy to answer any UFO-related questions, and pretty much on any subject. I have a Facebook page, Brent Alexi Mitchell. You're welcome to go to my Facebook page, and you can leave me a question or send me a Facebook message, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
And also, they would like to know if you post on the MUFON website.
No. I'm one of those people that I think that the UFO research phenomenon needs to be and maintain a certain degree of professionalism. And so I'm more than happy to be on a show like yours, Dee, because I absolutely believe that you are a professional person. But when it comes to other websites and some other things, they're not as professional, and so I don't deal with them.
Interesting. Will you be speaking anywhere?
I pretty much limit it to radio shows where I know the host and believe in what the person is trying to convey, and that is. So yes, I do speak. I've got a couple more radio dates within the next 2 weeks. As far as speaking at universities, nothing this summer. I've spoken at George Washington University in D.C. and Washington and Lee in Virginia. And I'm not young and I'm not handsome, and I don't turn on the ladies so much. So I limit it to radio and television.
Okay, well, I caught the Discovery Channel, I think it was, Discovery Channel's Monsters and Mysteries of Alaska. And when I heard you talking on there, I thought, I want him on my show. I mean, because you did convey yourself quite well on the program and did a good job, I thought.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be on your show. And as I had mentioned to you before, there are lots of clues as to the quality of a program and the quality of a person, and absolutely a pleasure to deal with you and to be on your show. I think it's more people like you are needed in this field, and you're doing an outstanding job.
Well, I thank you very much and appreciate it. I think you do a good job, too. Any parting words before we go?
I think that your audience would very much enjoy coming up to the state of Alaska. It's a unique place. There are lots of things to see. There are mysteries, and there are some exciting things both in the paranormal and way of UFOs, and just plain old gorgeous scenery and more awesome animals than you can ever imagine. So if someone does come up to Alaska and want to talk UFOs, look me up. I'm in the phone book, and I'm off the road system, but not all that far, so you'd absolutely be welcome here in Alaska.
Hey, well, thank you for joining us tonight. I enjoyed it a lot, and I know a lot more about Alaska than I did 2 hours ago.
That's great.
And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and everyone in our Pal Talk Auditorium. You were great as usual. Stay tuned for Voice of the People, hosted by November Hansen. Her guest this evening is author Spooky Sanchez. Please join us again next Saturday for Eye to the Sky, the UFO Synopsis. Until then, keep an eye to the sky. Good night, everyone.